Well, you can buy hemp drinks at dispensaries, convenience stores, and shops across Missouri. But lawmakers haven't put any regulations on the industry. Our Missouri Capitol reporter Hannah Falcon spoke with one hemp beverage manufacturer about why he wants oversight.
Walk on into Slap Happy Hemporium in Rosebud, Missouri. You'll find a change of pace from the rows of antique stores and retro diners.
What's your favorite?
This one is definitely my favorite. It's cherry cream.
John Grady and his
2
wife
scoops.
Kara
We got
grow,
raised
manufacture, and sell hemp products.
This is Mellocello.
Their baby being these Italian-inspired hemp seltzers.
We wanted to be that nice alcohol alternative, something you can go take on a float trip just like you would wine coolers or beers.
Hemp drinks are gaining popularity quickly. An economic study shows the hemp beverage industry could make about $75.4 million every year in Missouri.
We believe in treating hemp beverages just like alcohol.
That's what Republican State Senator Mike Henderson is proposing in the bill he presented to fellow lawmakers Tuesday. It would regulate the hemp industry similarly to the way alcohol is regulated, including a 7% tax, the same as hard liquor, and a 21-year age minimum to buy or serve hemp drinks. The bill was amenable to most, but not all.
What the proponents are requesting is that you expend significant state resources to set up a contingent, highly regulated framework on the hope and prayer that Congress either kicks the can down the road, dramatically amends the law.
The marijuana lobby group MoCan Trade says lawmakers are wasting their time with this bill, as the federal government debates a change to the definition of hemp, which could significantly impact which products are legal. Senator Henderson's bill is being considered by a committee. They could vote on it as soon as next week. Reporting in Jefferson City, I'm Hannah Falcon, WGEM News.